Alright guys, welcome to another video, and this video is going to be about showing you guys the design for my new project that I plan to start work on pretty soon and hopefully try to finish it by sometime next year. Just to give you guys a bit of background behind the project, so from the previous videos you might already know that I was rebuilding an engine for my E55, but midway through the rebuild I decided that while I am putting in all that effort into rebuilding this engine, might as well put it in a lighter car and make the most use of like the engine and all the components that are already in the E55. I was originally planning to move everything to another production car because part of the time attack regulations are that whatever car you're competing in has to be based on a production car. But after considering how big of a job that would be moving all the components to a different car and still having all those issues, maybe the turbo is not fitting in the engine bay or things like cooling and all those other things, I decided that it's probably a way better idea to just start from scratch and just build a chassis specifically meant for this engine and drivetrain and everything, just so everything works out perfectly. So I've been trying to scratch a design together over the past few weeks because it does make a lot more sense to actually make better use of all these components since I already have everything. Like I have 8 piston caliper brakes in this car, I have an amazing engine in this car, so might as well use it in a proper track focused car that is going to make the best use of all these components rather than just bolting them back in an E55. So to show you guys the design for the new project, this is the car that I plan to make. This is what it's going to look like from the front. Here's what it's going to look like from the side. This is what it's going to look like from the back. No one's going to be able to tell that's not an E55. So I know you guys might be thinking that's a whole different car that doesn't look anything like the E55, but believe it or not, under the bodywork, it's all the same components taken from the E55, the same engine, the same transmission, the same differential, and even the suspension components are pretty much the same, and even the same wheels and tires. So yeah, it's basically all the components taken from the E55, bolted onto a lightweight tube steel chassis, and then covered with all the bodywork, and that is going to be the new project. So if you've been following this channel long enough, you might already know that I made something similar to this. Not exactly this thing, but I made a tube steel car that was based on components from a Honda Civic. It didn't have any bodywork or anything at all. It was a much simpler project. But yeah, just judging by how fast that car turned out, even with parts from a Honda Civic, this car should be fast at a whole different level. So I'll start off by explaining the design of the car, and then later I'll get on to how I actually plan to make all this. So this is the design that I've come up with so far. It's still not fully complete, but the only things left are things like the size of the differential and the attachment points for the suspension. I still have to take the E55 apart fully so I can actually measure out like the sizes of the differential and where the suspension needs to be attached to the knuckles and all those things. So those minor details are going to have to wait till later. But at least for the major parts, like things like where the engine is going to be placed or what the chassis is going to look like, that's pretty much what everything is going to be like. So I've put the car side by side over here. This is the car without all the bodywork, and this is what the full complete car is going to look like, just so you guys can get a better picture of what everything is going to be like. And well, just to tell you what my goal with this project is, my goal with this project is to make everything weigh 900 kilograms, like the complete car should weigh 900 kilograms, which is going to be an extremely difficult target to reach, but after weighing all the engine and transmission and most of the parts from the E55, I believe that it is possible to reach this target. And that's really why I've tried to make everything as light as possible. So I've only designed the bare minimum amount of bodywork required to just cover everything. So even there's not going to be any windshield, even the roof, there's not going to be any roof. And even the suspension is all open, and even the top of the engine is all exposed from here. So yeah, it's just the bare minimum amount of bodywork required and nothing extra really. And to start off by explaining the placement of the components, so the first thing you might already have noticed in this car is that the engine sits way further back than it does in the E55. So in the E55 the engine sits somewhere in between the front two tires, so like somewhere over here, whereas in this car the engine is pushed way further back, so it sits like, it's more of a front mid-engine configuration rather than a front engine configuration. So right behind the engine is the transmission, just like it is in the E55, then the propeller shaft, the differential at the back, and then two axles going to the tires. So the only thing I'm going to need to modify in the drivetrain is that the propeller shaft is going to be way shorter than it was in the E55. That's just because the transmission now sits way closer to the differential. And the other thing that I'm going to need to modify is that the axles are going to have to be much longer than they were in the E55. And that's because this car is going to have a much wider track than the E55. The E55, I believe the overall width of the car was 1800 millimeters or something around that, whereas this car is going to be a full 2000 millimeters wide. So it's going to be quite a lot wider than the E55. 2 meters is actually the maximum width most race cars will be, because most racing regulations only allow a car to be 2 meters wide. And the other thing is also that the engine sits way lower than it usually sits in the E55, so the engine is literally the lowest point in the car. Well, it's as low as the chassis and all the rest of the car. The only thing below the engine is going to be a plank. So there's going to be a plank running the length of the car. The purpose of the plank is just so that when the car hits the ground, it doesn't damage the engine or the chassis or anything. The plank is the only thing that scrapes against the ground usually when the car hits the ground. So yeah, that's going to be the only thing below the engine. Other than that, the engine is at the lowest possible point it can be mounted. And same with most of the other heavy things in the car, they're going to be mounted really low. And so the benefit of all these changes is going to be that the center of gravity is going to be way lower, the track is going to be much wider, and the weight distribution is going to be much better since the engine is placed so much farther back. It's going to be hopefully somewhere close to a 50-50 weight distribution. Talking about some other benefits, the other thing in the E55 was that cooling was so difficult to manage because the radiator sits so close to the engine that there's barely any place to add any more cooling because the engine bay is so cramped. Whereas in this car, what I've done is that the radiators are going to be moved to this section at the front of the car. So there's going to be air coming in from this part, and then the air is going to go through the radiators and exit from the top. The benefit of this design is going to be, first of all, the radiators are at a much more open space, so they can actually, there's a lot of space for the air to go. So hopefully even the same radiator is going to do a much better job in this car as it did in the E55. So hopefully in terms of cooling, it's going to be much better. The second advantage is going to be that the intercoolers are placed at a much better location. So whereas in the E55 I had to put all the intercoolers where the rear seats usually go, just because that was the only place where I could fit intercoolers that size because there was no place in the front of the car. In this car, what I've done is that the intercoolers will be placed on the side, and these are fairly large intercoolers. So hopefully all the intake air temperature issues are going to be gone with this design. So the air is going to come in from all the side of the bodywork. That's why all this section is open, so the air can go right to these intercoolers, and then it's going to exit from here and then just go to the back of the car. The other benefit of this design is also the brake cooling ducts. If you remember from the E55, I had a lot of issues with brake cooling because it was really difficult to manage. So I was running brake cooling ducts, but even they weren't enough in some of the slower tracks where there wasn't enough airflow. It's pretty much the same design as the brake ducts you see on Formula One cars. So the air is just going to be drawn in from this duct, and this duct is going to lead straight to the center of the brake disc. The other benefit is going to be that since now the engine bay is actually designed to fit turbos, I would actually be able to fit turbos on the side of the engine. So rather than in the E55 where the turbos were placed at the back, now the turbos are going to be placed right on the side of the engine. The other benefit this will provide is not only will the turbos work more efficiently because they're getting hotter exhaust, the other benefit would be that everything is going to be much lighter. The exhaust in this car is so much smaller, like this is the exhaust manifold that's going to go to the turbos, and then this is the downpipe. So the exhaust just exits from here. There's no pipe running the whole length of the car. Just to tell you, the exhaust in the E55 weighs 40 kilograms. Just the pipe and the mufflers and resonators, all those things, 40 kilograms, that's a massive weight saving. And the intercoolers being on the side of the turbos, that's also going to be a big weight saving because pipes won't have to run the entire length of the car. And also in terms of turbo lag, since the volume of air like running from the turbos to the intercoolers and then going back to the engine, it's a much shorter path. So getting to the design of the suspension, here's what the suspension is going to look like. So I am planning to take the same coilovers that I have in the E55 for now, just because I've already tried them, I know they work. But they're going to have to be mounted in a pushrod configuration in this car. So here's what the suspension is going to look like. I haven't drawn anything in too much detail right now, but this is just to figure out the places for all the components that they will fit and they will function properly. And the only thing, I am limited in terms of a few things because I'm using a steering rack from a Mazda Miata. So this is the steering rack over here. And I know it's not in that much detail, but this is the exact size that I measured from that steering rack. So the thing about that is that where the ball joint of the steering rack is, all your other ball joints have to line up with that position just to make sure that the suspension doesn't have any bumps here. That's why that was a slight limitation in the suspension design. But other than that, I am leaving most of these attachment points for the suspension adjustable so that I will be able to move these control arms to different locations just to change the geometry of the suspension. Same with the anti-roll bar and also the these cantilevers or the rockers. They're going to have multiple attachment points for the pushrod so that the spring rates can be changed around. Talking about the rear suspension design is fairly incomplete right now. That's just because I haven't taken the E55 apart from the back, so I don't know the sizes of the knuckles and where all these control arms need to be attached on the rear suspension. So that's something that I'll have to leave for later. But what I am planning to do is that I'll try to get the same pushrod suspension that I have on the E55 to work on this car. It can't be mounted in the same configuration because this car will not have that much space at the back to mount the whole thing, so I'll need to mount it in a different configuration, possibly mounting the springs longitudinally rather than going sideways. Now I know a couple of people were commenting on the suspension that it's not a good design because the springs bend because of the rockers moving, but that's not true at all. The way these springs even work in their normal application is that there's a pivot point right here on the lower control arm, and the distance of the springs from the pivot point on this rocker is exactly the same as it goes on the normal suspension setup. So the springs work exactly the same way as they're meant to be used on the E350, which these springs were actually meant for. So yeah, in terms of that, that's not true at all. You never have pivots on both sides of a coil spring. The only time you have pivots is for the shock, when it's a coilover shock. But whenever a spring is used alone, there's never a pivot point. You'll never find that on any car. The reason I do want to stick to the same suspension is because I've already tried it on the E55, and it's something that worked extremely well on the E55, and it's worked pretty reliably. That's why I know it's already a design that works. I'll try to either use the same suspension at the back of this, or go with something of a similar design. Talking about the floor of the car, yeah, it's gonna have a flat floor, so all the floor is perfectly flat, and it's also gonna have a diffuser at the back. And the floor of the car is also shaped with the diffuser, so you might have noticed that the chassis is actually a lot higher from the back. So the whole floor of the car is shaped to actually accommodate a bigger diffuser. So the benefit of this like sloping shape is that it's going to help the air stay attached to the underside of the car, which helps make more downforce. I haven't done any CFD or anything so far, but that is something that I plan to do later. Some other things aerodynamically that I plan to do on the car is that it's also going to have a rear wing, and I'm planning to use the same mechanism that the E55 had for the moving rear wing. But other than that, the body panels in general, I've tried to keep it as simple as possible. So they're simple shapes, they're mostly flat body panels. That's just because to make them easy to make, because I do want to make this a car that I should be able to crash it on a wall one day and then be able to put it back together the next day. That's why I'm planning to keep the design of the body panels as simple as possible. That's why they're mostly all just flat shapes, and they're going to be fairly easy to make. The only things that are going to be really difficult to make are going to be the fenders, so the front and rear fenders. They're fairly complex shapes. And the only body panels that are going to be carried over from the E55 are going to be this rear trunk lid and the tail lights. And the reason is that when I started designing the body panels, I was trying to make this car look visually similar to the E55. But later, when I actually looked at the dimensions, this car was like, the dimensions are way different than the E55. That's why it would have been impossible to make the rest of the car look like the E55. You can even see from the back how much wider the tires are coming out from the rear section of the car. So this rear section is actually all carried over from the E55. So getting to how I actually plan to build this car, so the first part is going to be moving the turbos to the front. So I'm going to be moving the turbos to the side of the engine, and then after that's done, I'll have to measure the engine again just to make sure that the width of the engine and everything is the same so that it will fit in the chassis. If the engine actually turns out to be wider, then I will still have the chance to actually widen the chassis to make sure that everything does fit. The same way, I will still have to take the E55 apart, so I'm going to have to take the E55 apart from the rear, take the rear subframe off, take the differential out, and actually take all the measurements from that just to make sure that everything will fit in this design, and also to complete the rest of the design, because right now the design isn't fully complete. There's also going to be a part of the chassis that's going to extend all the way till the front, so for holding the radiators and also for holding this front part of the splitter. So there's going to be thinner tubes. They're not going to be as thick as the rest of the chassis. Same with the rear. There's actually going to be some more frame at the rear that's going to extend all the way till the back of the diffuser, so the diffuser is supported and also the rear wing is supported. So those are things that I still have to design. But once all that is done, once the design is finalized, and once I've taken all the components that I need from the E55 out of the E55, then I'll start with actually making the chassis. The chassis isn't going to be too hard to make. It's just steel tubes. I already have a steel tube bender. So yeah, it's just going to be a matter of like taking all these measurements from the design and actually making the tube steel chassis. After the chassis is done, the next step is going to be making the suspension. The suspension is a little harder because things actually have to work properly. So the alignment has to be right, and all the angles do have to be right for the suspension to work out perfectly. Once the suspension is done, and once basically the whole structure of the car is done, then I'm finally going to be moving to the body panels. I'm going to start off with the floor. The floor is not going to be that hard to make because it's fairly flat panels. But once the floor is made, then the next step is going to be actually making all the body panels. That is going to take quite a while. The panels, I'm planning to make them out of either carbon fiber or fiberglass, depending on what the budget's going to be. Obviously, I want to make them out of carbon fiber because carbon fiber is a lot lighter than fiberglass, but it also does cost pretty much 10 times as much as fiberglass. That's why making the whole car out of carbon fiber, that might get way too much to the expensive side, so I might have to only use carbon fiber where it's really necessary and stick to fiberglass for the rest of it. Now, as far as all the mechanical components go, things should be fairly straightforward, but as far as all the electrical things go, things will be extremely complicated and extremely messy with this car. So I have two plans. My first plan is to try to make everything work the way it does in the E55 in this car, so carry over all the same electronics and try to make them work the same way. But I know that's going to be a really difficult thing. So my plan B is that if all that doesn't work, the second plan is going to be to just get rid of all the electronics from the E55, go with the standalone ECU for controlling the engine and a standalone transmission controller for controlling the transmission. That way I won't have to rely with any of the electronics from the E55. But all things considered, judging by how good this car is going to be if everything works out and how fast this car is going to be, it's going to be something like a 700 horsepower car, possibly more than that, because I know the engine is going to be capable of quite a lot of power, and the car is going to weigh like extremely light, 900 kilograms, somewhere around that. So things are going to get pretty close to a 1-to-1 power to weight ratio. So yeah, the car should definitely be an extremely quick car. So I think it's definitely a really cool idea for a project, because rather than wasting all that money on the E55, because first of all, the E55 is not a cheap car to track. Just to give you some of the costs with that car, the tires alone for that car cost $2,000 and they only last 3 or 4 track days. The brake pads last only 3 track days and the brake pads cost $400. And even that cost is nothing at all compared to how much the car freaking breaks down every time you take it to the track. So rather than just fixing the same issues over and over again with that car, I think this is probably a way better idea to move to a car like this. It's going to be expensive and it's going to be hard to make in the first place, but once the car is made, this is obviously something that is not only going to have much faster lap times, but it's also going to be something that's going to be way more enjoyable. And it's actually going to be cheaper to run because it's going to be less harder on the tires since it's a lighter car. It's going to be less harder on the brakes, and hopefully everything is going to last that much longer too. So yeah, in terms of cost in the long run, I think this project might even end up costing me less than the E55. So considering all that, I think it's definitely an amazing idea, at least for me. But let me know what you guys think about this project. And one last thing, the project does need a new name. I still haven't decided a new name for this project yet. So if you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments and I'll try to pick a name by the next video. But yeah, that's it for this video. Thanks a lot for watching and let me know what you guys think about this project.